It is one of America's oldest unsolved mysteries, and it happened in our own backyard. What happened to the lost colony of Roanoke?
In 1590, an entire English colony simply disappeared. No bodies, no struggle, just empty houses and one word carved into a post, CROATOAN.
What happened to that colony is one of the big unanswered questions of American history.
For centuries, Roanoke's fate has haunted historians, fueling theories of war, starvation, and even curses. And now it looks like someone might have cracked it.
Archaeologists have been digging on Hatteras, what was called CROATOAN, and they have come up with some remarkable evidence.
Not with treasure maps or tall tales, but with real evidence that could finally explain what happened to the people of Roanoke. The vanishing. The story of Roanoke begins like the opening of a great adventure, full of ambition, hope, and danger. In 1587, more than 100 English settlers set sail for the New World, led by explorer John White. They dreamed of building England's first permanent colony on the shores of what is now North Carolina. But what began as a daring mission of expansion would soon turn into one of history's most chilling disappearances. When the colonists landed on Roanoke Island, things were far from easy. The summer heat was relentless, mosquitoes swarmed the swamps, and food was scarce. Still, they built small homes, planted crops, and tried to form alliances with nearby Native American tribes. Among the settlers were families, men, women, and children. Even Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America, came into the world there. It wasn't just a colony. It was meant to be the start of a new life. But danger was always close. The settlers' arrival had already stirred tension among the local tribes, especially after earlier English expeditions had gone badly. Resources ran low, tempers rose, and fear crept into daily life. Desperate, John White, who was both the governor and a grandfather to baby Virginia, decided to return to England to request supplies. It was supposed to be a quick trip. He promised to return as soon as possible. Unfortunately, history had other plans. When White reached England, he found the country at war with Spain. Every ship was needed to defend against the Spanish Armada. White's pleas to return to his colony were ignored for years. By the time he finally managed to secure a vessel and sail back across the Atlantic, 3 long years had passed. It was August 1590 when he finally set foot again on Roanoke Island, and what he found was pure silence. The settlement looked abandoned, as if the people had vanished into thin air. There were no signs of violence or fire. Houses stood empty, tools were left behind, and the only clue, carved into a wooden post, was a single haunting word: CROATOAN. Another carving, just CRO, was found on a nearby tree. White had instructed the colonists to carve a Maltese cross if they were in danger, but there wasn't one. That small detail gave him hope. Maybe they had simply moved to CROATOAN Island, now known as Hatteras Island, home to a friendly tribe. But bad weather and dwindling supplies prevented his search. The ships turned back to England, and John White never saw his daughter, granddaughter, or any of the colonists again. The story spread quickly across England. An entire colony, gone without a trace. People speculated endlessly. Were they killed by hostile tribes? Did they starve and perish in the wilderness? Did they try to sail back home and sink along the way? No one knew, and over the centuries, the mystery only deepened. Archaeologists later uncovered remnants of pottery, tools, and European-style artifacts scattered along the Carolina coast, but none could be tied directly to the lost colonists. Even the famous word CROATOAN became a kind of ghost story in itself, appearing in pop culture, books, and legends about curses and supernatural forces. Some believed disease wiped them out. Others whispered of assimilation, that they blended into local tribes and lost their English identity forever. The lost colony of Roanoke became America's first great mystery. For historians, it wasn't just about what happened to the colonists, it was about what their disappearance meant. This was supposed to be the birth of English America, but instead, it became a haunting lesson about survival, isolation, and the limits of human endurance. Roanoke symbolized both ambition and tragedy, the price of exploration in a world where nature, politics, and fate all conspired against human control. And yet, centuries later, the question still burns. What truly happened to them? For a long time, every new clue only made things more confusing. Bits of European artifacts were found near native villages, but those could have come from trade, not survivors. A few skeletons unearthed nearby showed European ancestry, but dating them precisely was nearly impossible. Even DNA testing offered more questions than answers. Still, some experts refused to give up. Among them was one researcher who approached the case not as a ghost story, but as a cold case, with fresh eyes and cutting-edge tools. He believed the answer had been hiding in plain sight all along, buried beneath centuries of misunderstanding and myth. Could it be that the colonists didn't vanish at all, but simply became part of another world? For centuries, Roanoke's mystery seemed unsolvable until one expert followed a centuries-old map and uncovered a clue that changed everything, an expert's claim. For more than 400 years, Roanoke's disappearance puzzled historians, archaeologists, and treasure hunters alike. But recently, one modern expert claims he may have cracked the code. His name is Scott Dawson, a historian and archaeologist who has spent years digging literally and figuratively into Roanoke's past. His new theory doesn't rely on wild guesses or ghost stories. Instead, it draws from real evidence found where few thought to look. Hatteras Island, the very place hinted at in that haunting word, CROATOAN. Dawson's research started with a simple question. What if the colonists didn't disappear? What if they just moved? After all, John White had told them to carve a sign if they relocated, and CROATOAN was that very clue. The problem, Dawson realized, was that no one had ever searched the island properly. For centuries, treasure hunters looked in the wrong places, focusing on Roanoke itself. So he and his team decided to dig deeper, literally. What they found was astonishing. Buried beneath layers of sand and time were artifacts that didn't belong to the native Croatan tribe, but clearly came from English settlers. Pieces of pottery identical to those made in the 16th century England. Iron tools, musket parts, and even fragments of decorative items that suggested European craftsmanship. These weren't random leftovers from trade. They matched exactly what the colonists would have used. Even more striking were clues of coexistence. The dig site showed both native and English styles of pottery and tools together, sometimes in the same layer of soil. This suggested that instead of dying off or being wiped out, some colonists might have joined the Croatan tribe, blending their cultures. Dawson's discovery supported one of the oldest but least glamorous theories about Roanoke, that the settlers survived by integrating into local native communities. It wasn't a story of sudden death or supernatural disappearance, but one of survival and adaptation. But then came the twist. In 2012, researchers studying an old map drawn by John White himself, La Virginia Pars, noticed something curious. Using infrared imaging, they discovered a hidden patch, as if someone had covered up a marking centuries ago. Beneath it was a faint symbol of a fort, one that didn't appear on any known records. This hidden marking, placed near the Albemarle Sound in North Carolina, reignited the debate. Could this be where the lost colonists had resettled? Historians from the First Colony Foundation began investigating. Their excavations at the site, dubbed Site X, unearthed European artifacts dating to the late 1500s, exactly the right time period. Pieces of a slate writing tablet, early English pottery, and metal items all suggested an English presence far inland from Roanoke. So now, there were two potential sites, one on Hatteras Island, one further inland, both containing evidence of English settlement. What if both were right? That's exactly what Dawson believes. He proposes that the colonists didn't stick together. When John White failed to return, some may have gone south to live with the CROATOAN tribe, while others headed inland in search of safer territory. In other words, the lost colony might not have vanished, it simply split up to survive. It's a theory that paints the settlers not as victims, but as resourceful survivors. And it makes sense. They were stranded in a harsh environment, surrounded by uncertainty. Joining local tribes or moving inland would have been their best chance at staying alive. Of course, not everyone agrees. Some historians argue that the artifacts could have reached those sites through trade, that Native Americans might have acquired them long after the colonists disappeared. Others think disease, starvation, or conflict still played a deadly role. But even skeptics admit Dawson's evidence has reshaped the entire conversation. His discoveries connect the dots between the historical record, the carvings on the post, and the physical evidence found centuries later. It also challenges how we think about history itself. For years, Roanoke was treated like a ghost story, a mystery meant to stay unsolved. But with every shard of pottery and hidden mark on a map, the story feels less like a tragedy and more like a survival tale. In fact, new DNA research is beginning to support this idea. Some modern-day families in North Carolina's coastal regions, especially among tribes like the Lumbee, have oral traditions claiming descent from English settlers. Genetic studies are ongoing, but the possibility adds another layer to the mystery. Maybe the legacy of Roanoke isn't lost at all. It's living quietly within people today. And yet, the story doesn't end there. For every piece of evidence that points toward survival, there are just as many that suggest danger and darkness. Because if some settlers did make it, what happened to the rest? Why were there no signs of them left behind on Roanoke Island itself? Why no messages? No remains? No second clue? Some researchers think they may have faced a combination of struggles: famine, illness, and possible attacks from rival tribes. Others hint at something even more unsettling, that the colony fell apart from the inside long before help could arrive. Still, the new theory has given hope to historians who've spent lifetimes searching for answers. For the first time in centuries, Roanoke feels less like a legend and more like a story of human resilience, a reminder that survival sometimes means letting go of identity and becoming something new. The lost colony might not have been lost after all. It might have simply evolved. But even if some settlers survived, the big question remains: how did an entire colony disappear so completely that it took centuries to notice? The search for answers. Ever since John White's heartbreaking return in 1590, countless people have tried to piece together the puzzle of Roanoke. From early colonial records to high-tech archaeological digs, the search has stretched across generations, each new discovery offering a glimpse into the truth, but never quite revealing it all. The story of Roanoke has been revisited so many times that it feels almost mythical. But beneath the legend lies a relentless effort by historians and scientists to track down every possible clue. What happened after John White saw that single word carved into the post, CROATOAN? has haunted researchers for centuries. The earliest investigations began not long after the colony's disappearance. Later, English expeditions sent to the New World searched for survivors, but found nothing conclusive. The new Jamestown settlers, who arrived in Virginia in 1607, even claimed to have heard stories from local tribes about white people living inland, but when they looked for them, they came up empty-handed. For the next few centuries, the mystery faded into folklore. Roanoke became a ghost story told by candlelight, a warning about ambition, exploration, and what happens when humanity overreaches. Then came the 19th and 20th centuries, when amateur historians and treasure hunters began scouring Roanoke Island with shovels, hoping to strike gold or at least history. What they mostly found were mosquito bites and disappointment. That all changed with modern archaeology. In the early 2000s, advanced mapping, ground-penetrating radar, and more precise excavation methods reignited serious academic interest in Roanoke. Suddenly, this centuries-old mystery wasn't just an old tale, it was a scientific challenge. Teams from the First Colony Foundation, National Geographic, and local historical societies started unearthing real artifacts, pottery shards, gun flints, iron nails, and fragments of armor that could be traced back to the late 1500s. Each item was a piece of a much larger puzzle. But instead of forming a clear picture, they told a story of scattering. For instance, while Dawson's Hatteras Island finds suggested a southern migration, the inland site, Site X, revealed an entirely different chapter. There, researchers found English ceramics mixed with Native American artifacts, hinting that another group of colonists had taken refuge inland, possibly near friendly tribes. Even more intriguing were clues of adaptation. European materials were being used in Native American ways, pottery pieces reshaped into tools, iron scraps turned into ornaments. This blending of cultures hinted at survival, not extinction. The colonists may have lived on, not as English settlers, but as part of native life. The mystery deepened when scientists began examining tree ring data from the late 1500s. By analyzing ancient wood samples, they discovered that the years between 1587 and 1589, the colony's critical period, were marked by one of the worst droughts in the region's history. Crops would have failed, water sources dried up. The settlers were trapped between starvation and desperation. So maybe the colonists hadn't been wiped out by enemies, maybe nature itself had driven them away. With no food and no way to signal England, they might have split up, following rivers and seeking safer land. But not everyone buys the peaceful migration theory. Some historians still argue that Roanoke's fate took a darker turn. Rival tribes were known to be hostile to the English after earlier conflicts. Disease could have spread quickly in such conditions. There's even speculation that some colonists may have resorted to violence, either against others or themselves, as survival became impossible. And then there are the truly strange clues. In the 30s, a series of mysterious stones known as the Dare Stones began appearing across the American South. The first, supposedly carved by John White's daughter, Eleanor Dare, told of hardship, death, and a massacre by native tribes, even claiming that Virginia Dare, the baby, was killed. Dozens more stones surfaced, forming a dramatic tale of struggle and sorrow. But here's the twist. Most of them were fakes. While the first stone may have had some historical credibility, later ones were proven to be forgeries, created by opportunists hoping to cash in on the mystery. Still, they reignited public fascination with Roanoke, inspiring books, movies, and even ghost stories about the cursed colony. Then came a wave of DNA testing projects. Modern descendants from native tribes and local families in North Carolina came forward, curious if they might be linked to the settlers. While the results were inconclusive, they revealed genetic traces of European ancestry that predated later migrations, just enough to keep hope alive. Even today, the search continues. Archaeologists still dig cautiously through the soil of Hatteras Island and inland sites, hoping for something definitive: a nameplate, a grave, a single artifact that directly connects to one of the known colonists. But so far, no such discovery has tied everything together. Still, the persistence of those researchers says something powerful. Roanoke isn't just about the past. It's about our unending drive to know, to understand what happened when human ambition met the wheeled unknown. Because the truth is, the lost colony wasn't the last mystery of its kind. It was the first of many, the first warning that history doesn't always leave neat endings. Sometimes, it just fades. And as more evidence emerges, historians are beginning to see Roanoke less as a single event and more as a mirror, one that reflects the courage, mistakes, and stubborn hope of everyone who came after. Native tribes, encounters, and misunderstood histories. Every mystery has more than one side, and the story of Roanoke is no exception. For centuries, the lost colony has been told through English eyes: the frightened settlers, the missing families, the lonely carvings on trees. But what about the people who were already there? The native tribes who watched strange ships appear on their horizon and strangers build homes on their shores. To truly understand Roanoke, we have to listen to the voices history nearly erased. Before the English ever set foot on Roanoke Island, the region was home to thriving native communities, the Algonquian-speaking tribes, including the CROATOAN, CROATOAN, and Dasamongoponka peoples. They had deep ties to the land, knowledge of the seasons, and a social network that stretched from the coast to the forests inland. When the colonists arrived in 1587, these tribes already had long memories of previous European visitors, and not all of those memories were good. Two earlier English expeditions, led by explorers like Sir Richard Grenville, had already created tension. In one incident, the English accused a local of stealing a silver cup and burned an entire village in retaliation. Imagine what that looked like from the native perspective. Foreign invaders arriving in giant boats, demanding supplies, and punishing entire communities for small misunderstandings. It was no wonder the 1,587 settlers faced uneasy stares instead of open arms. When John White and his colonists came ashore, they hoped to rebuild those broken relationships. For a short while, they succeeded. The Croatan people, led by Chief Manteo, became allies. Manteo had even traveled to England before, learning their language and customs. His friendship probably saved the colonists' lives more than once, helping them fish and navigate the coastline. But outside that fragile alliance, mistrust ran deep. The Secotun and Dasamongoponke tribes still remembered Grenville's violence. They were wary, and rightly so. Food shortages made trade difficult, and misunderstandings easily turned deadly. Archaeologists believe the colonists depended heavily on native generosity. But once the drought hit, even that supply line may have collapsed. Still, when the colonists vanished, the native tribes didn't vanish with them. They kept the stories alive. Generations later, oral traditions among several North Carolina tribes told of pale-skinned, fair-haired people who lived among them, speaking a strange language and crafting metal tools. The Lumbee tribe, in particular, has long claimed ancestry from both native peoples and the Roanoke settlers. Early European visitors to their region in the 1700s even noted that some Lumbee spoke English phrases and practiced Christian customs, centuries before missionaries reached them. If true, that would mean the lost colony wasn't truly lost, it simply became part of something larger, woven into native life and identity. But why didn't the English record this? Why was the story of integration ignored? Part of the reason lies in pride. For England, the failure of Roanoke was an embarrassment. By the time Jamestown succeeded in 1607, the Crown wanted a clean narrative, one of triumph, not loss. The idea that English settlers had gone native and blended with local tribes didn't fit that image. So the story was quietly buried, and native voices were silenced in the official record. Archaeological work in recent decades has started to confirm what those oral traditions said all along. Excavations on Hatteras Island, the homeland of the Croatan tribe, have uncovered a fascinating mix of artifacts. English-style tools reshaped by native hands, copper ornaments hammered from old European scrap, and pottery showing blended designs. These weren't souvenirs, they were signs of cultural fusion. To the Croatan, the English may not have been lost, but adopted. After all, their world valued kinship and community. If strangers were starving, why not take them in and teach them to live from the land? Survival, not conquest, was the priority. Of course, this story wasn't without tension. Other tribes further inland may have seen the settlers as threats or burdens. Some accounts hint at violent clashes, while others suggest peaceful coexistence. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, a mix of alliance, adaptation, and conflict, shaped by hunger and fear. But one thing is certain: the natives were never just bystanders. They were active participants in the Roanoke saga, guides, teachers, and perhaps even saviors. Without their help, the colonists wouldn't have lasted a single season. Modern historians are finally beginning to credit that. Many native researchers today emphasize how the Roanoke story mirrors a much bigger pattern: the meeting of two worlds that would eventually define America. The disappearance wasn't just about people vanishing, it was about cultures colliding, merging, and changing forever. By hearing the story through native eyes, we get a completely different ending. The colonists didn't die off in the wilderness or vanish into myth. They transformed. They learned, adapted, and became part of a community that already understood how to live with the land. In that sense, Roanoke wasn't a failure at all. It was the first fragile bridge between two civilizations, one that carried echoes of both survival and sorrow. Even today, the descendants of those tribes still tell stories of strangers who came from the sea and stayed. Their memory keeps the colony alive in ways no written record ever could. Sometimes the simplest explanation is also the most powerful. What if the true culprit wasn't a rival tribe or a failed rescue mission, but nature itself? How the land, weather, and isolation doomed the colony. When people talk about the lost colony of Roanoke, they often imagine conflict, mystery, or betrayal. But sometimes the simplest explanation is also the most powerful. What if the true culprit wasn't a rival tribe or a failed rescue mission, but nature itself? The world the Roanoke colonists stepped into was breathtaking, but also unforgiving. The Outer Banks of North Carolina, that long chain of barrier islands, are beautiful to look at and deadly to live on. Even today, they're known for shifting sands, violent storms, and waters that can swallow ships whole. Back in the 1500s, it was even worse. When the settlers arrived in 1587, they faced a landscape that was alien in every sense. Dense forests hemmed them in from the west. Swamps bred disease-carrying mosquitoes, and the salty winds stripped away crops before they could mature. Their little settlement was perched between the roaring Atlantic and the tangled wilderness, a place both isolated and exposed. At first, they tried to make it work. They built small houses of timber and thatch, fished in the Sound, and planted European seeds. But the soil was sandy and poor. Crops that thrived in England withered under the sun. Food supplies dwindled and tensions rose. It wasn't long before the settlers realized that Roanoke wasn't the paradise they'd been promised. It was a trap. Modern science later confirmed just how dire their situation really was. In the late 90s, researchers from the University of Arkansas analyzed tree rings taken from centuries-old cypress trees near the site. The results were shocking. Between 1587 and 1589, the exact years the colonists were stranded, the region suffered one of the worst droughts in 800 years. That meant no rain for crops, dried-up streams, and dying wildlife. The settlers were essentially cut off, surrounded by water they couldn't drink and land that refused to feed them. Imagine the desperation. Every day, the settlers would have watched their food stores shrink, their children cry from hunger, and the skies stay painfully clear. The ocean offered fish, but without enough nets or boats, even that wasn't reliable. Disease likely followed hunger, spreading through the cramped, mosquito-filled huts. And then came the hurricanes. The Outer Banks lie directly in the path of Atlantic storm systems. Violent tempests could appear out of nowhere, shredding tents, flooding camps, and tearing apart fragile homes. A single storm could erase any progress the settlers made. Their wooden fortifications, if they even survived long enough to be built, would have stood no chance against 100-mile-per-hour winds. To make matters worse, Roanoke Island was isolated by geography. The shifting sandbars and shallow sounds made it incredibly difficult for ships to approach safely. Supply runs, even in perfect weather, were a nightmare. And when the English-Spanish War broke out in Europe, every ship that might have come to their rescue was instead used for battle. For the colonists, there was no escape, no easy way out, no lifeline across the ocean. So, what did they do? They adapted, or tried to. Archaeological evidence suggests they began relying on local native tribes, likely the Croatan people, for help. They traded, learned, and tried to blend in. But even that wasn't easy. Drought didn't just affect the English. It hit the native communities too, putting strain on resources and alliances. It's entirely possible that tensions grew as food became scarce. In this way, nature itself became the invisible hand that guided every decision. It forced the settlers into desperate measures, splitting up, moving inland, or joining other groups to survive. It didn't kill them in one dramatic event. It wore them down slowly, day after day, until the idea of remaining on Roanoke Island simply became impossible. Even modern-day scientists have been amazed at how harsh that environment truly is. Some have recreated models of 16th-century weather patterns to understand what the colonists endured. Their conclusion? Surviving there would have been almost impossible for anyone, let alone newcomers from a cold green island across the sea. And yet, what's remarkable is that the settlers didn't give up immediately. The signs of resilience, repairs to tools, reworked pottery, small attempts to keep building, all show that they tried to hold on. They fought against drought, heat, and the endless roar of the ocean for as long as humanly possible. Perhaps that's what makes the Roanoke mystery so compelling. It wasn't a single, sudden disappearance. It was a slow unraveling, a community pushed to the limits by an environment that refused to yield. There's a kind of tragic poetry in that. These people crossed an entire ocean chasing a dream, only to discover a land that was breathtakingly beautiful and utterly lethal. The same wilderness that promised a new life was the one that took it away. Today, when hurricanes still batter the Carolina coast, or when droughts scorch the fields nearby, it's hard not to think of those lost settlers, the sounds of their axes in the woods, their flickering fires against the wind, and their growing realization that nature always has the final word. Maybe they didn't vanish because of human conflict or mysterious curses. Maybe they were simply overpowered by the land itself, a force too vast, too wild, and too indifferent to care who lived or died on its shores. Roanoke wasn't just a human mystery. It was a natural one, a reminder that when explorers set out to conquer new worlds, the first challenge they faced wasn't each other, it was the planet itself. Hit subscribe, and don't miss stories like this. Now, let's hear what you think in the comment section.